This lecture will be looking at imperialism in Europe and across the world between 1871 and 1914. The main focus for this lecture is going to be the impact of imperialism on Africa, but we'll also look briefly at India and China as two other examples. Uh, this image that begins this lecture should give you a sense of the tone that'll be taken in regards to how we discuss imperialism, and usually it's not in a very positive fashion. There are some positives that one can find in terms of imperialism that obviously in a lot of cases benefited the imperialist country, the European countries, but often these benefits came at the expense of the people in the colonized countries themselves, whether it was the various nations of Africa, whether it was India, whether it was China. So most of the impacts of imperialism, in fact, tend to be relatively negative. They were not seen that way at the time by the imperialist powers in the West. They saw it as very positive. Uh, at least most of the people there did. This you can see here is an image. Remember that images are really important in terms of these lectures for understanding a lot of these themes. And so here is a themed image about imperialism, in this case British imperialism, that is obviously very, very negative. That is, it sees imperialism as a bad thing. And the easiest way to see that, of course, is the octopus tentacles that stretch out from England to all of these different lands here. And so you have tentacles with hands on the end of them that stretch. If you start in the top right corner, they go from Gibraltar to Cape Colony, Cyprus, Ireland, Jamaica, Canada, India, Egypt, Malta, Boerland, which is in um, South Africa, Australia. So all of these are areas that the British Empire ultimately will control, and the image obviously does not look upon that in a favorable fashion. You also have the idea that this individual here representing England has a top hat, which is going to be synonymous with both European power but also capitalism as well. And of course, the individual is relatively um plump, so one would assume from this image that the plumpness comes from siphoning things off from these other countries. So, why did imperialism take place at this time? Well, during this period here, if we look at the various motivations behind it, the main one is economic. This period in the 1870s is often referred to as the hard period of the Industrial Revolution. What this means is that when countries first industrialized, that's often called the easy period of industrialization, where there's a high demand for products. But by around 1870 or so, a lot of countries in Europe hit what we call the hard period of industrialization, which means they were producing more and more goods as industrialization spread, which meant supply was increasing fast, but demand was not keeping up because many of the workers were too poor to buy the goods that were produced. So one solution to this was, rather than improving the social and work conditions in Europe so that workers could afford more and to purchase more, the many imperialist powers, or what would become imperialist powers, decided that new colonies would be the way to go. New colonies that they could take over and then force them, kind of along the old mercantilist lines, to buy European goods, and that would improve their economy. So that was one aspect of it. Another aspect of it was that is connected to industrialization is the notion of rivalry and also nationalism. That is this idea that these countries had been competing in the Industrial Revolution, were now competing for other territories. And so, in terms of, and this created a rivalry between them. If we look at nationalism, nationalism isn't just based on a shared culture, but national pride becomes wrapped up in the economic strength of a country. By the late 19th century, became very common to argue that the way for a country to retain or to prove its greatness was to take on more colonies. And the idea was they thought this would solve economic problems. So the idea was that once undeveloped or underdeveloped in terms of industry nations were incorporated into the empire, it reaffirmed a sense of national pride, in part because the European countries had already industrialized. For countries that had never had a colony, many of them felt sort of an inferiority complex and wanted to snatch up colonies to prove that they had made it into the big boys club of imperialism. And because it was nationalistic, many times, and it was simply, in a lot of cases, a token, it didn't matter if the colony was all that economically feasible. Mostly, some of these were just for show, to show others that, yes, we too have colonies. We don't make any money off of them, but we have colonies. So, and this created a rivalry between many of the European nations. At this time, in the late 19th century, this was a period of almost constant warfare in Europe. And the idea was is that grabbing up a colony prevented your European rival from doing so. So not only were these colonies used for economic development, but a lot of the European countries also established naval bases there as well. So they're able to spread their power and influence throughout the world. Other than economic and nationalistic aspects, there is something that is very, very important here, and it's connected to the image that you may have been wondering about on the side there. This is this concept in Europe of, both of racism and cultural superiority, or perceived cultural superiority, which is why the term is in quotation marks. Uh, Racism obviously is not new in the 1870s. It had existed for centuries, as you saw in the discussion of the treatment of Africans, Native Americans, and the slave trade. But this took on a new twist. Racism took on a new twist in the late 19th century because it became pseudoscientific. I mean, it was a fake science, but it seemed to be scientific. And part of this goes back to some of the ideas that come out of the writings of Charles Darwin. Now, I should point out, Darwin himself was not promoting these racist ideas, but these were things that were built upon some of the things that he said. So in 1859, Charles Darwin published On the Origin of the Species. It was his theory of evolution. The idea that animals that are best adapted to their environment survive, they pass on their genetic traits, while the weaker, less adapted traits die out. Other thinkers, people like Herbert Spencer, adopted this idea and changed it into this notion of survival of the fittest. And this is what became known as social Darwinism. That is, the idea that they adapted this to society, and the idea is that the most advanced or the best races would eliminate or absorb the inferior one. The idea would be used to justify poverty and ethnic divisions and class divisions created by industrialization. It would be used to justify eugenics and forced sterilization, ethnic genocide, and of course, imperialism. Europeans thought that not only was their race superior, but so was their culture. And they saw it as their mission then to export their culture to various parts of the world. Now, I'm going to come back to this image that you see on the side there, which is an advertisement for Pear's soap. And underneath it says the white man's burden. So we'll come back to that in a second, but I want to start with looking at one of the selections you had from Rudyard Kipling. And this is what's called the white man's burden. So when you look at this text here, just this one excerpt from the text, the idea here is to see that how this reflects European ideals of imperialism and superiority. So notice how it says, the poem says, take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed, to serve your captives' needs, to wait in heavy harness, on fluttered folk and wild, your new-caught sullen peoples, half devil, half child. When your goal is nearest, the end for others sought, watch sloth and heathen folly, bring all your hopes to naught. Now, what Kipling is doing here is obviously starting out by saying he's making European synonymous with white, but he's saying take up the white European burden, send out the best of your people. What are you going to do? Well, to serve the needs of your captives, not in a servant sense. Notice it says captives. The idea that imperial colonized people are going to have certain needs. What are those needs? Well, they're going to need to be educated according to these imperialists. Because notice it says, serve your captives' needs, to wait in heavy harness. The idea that these people are bound, maybe not literally, but figuratively. Fluttered folk and wild. When you see these terms here, the idea that they are less civilized, that they're wild, that they're savage, I mean, it's reinforced in the next line, your new-caught sullen peoples, naturally they would be a bit peeved at being conquered by someone else. But the next part is important too. Half devil, half child. Here, the half devil part is an indication that they have not been Christianized. And the half-child part is part of the patronizing approach of imperialism, that these individuals are simply children to the adult Europeans, and they, like children, require some form of leadership to bring them about. So they need both Christianity and they need the leadership of the good, superior Europeans. Unfortunately, as Kipling says, unfortunately for him and the imperialist, the implication here is that it won't always work, because it says when you're closest to your goal, watch sloth and heathen folly. The idea that these individuals that they've conquered are lazy and stupid. That's the folly part there, and the heathen part's just emphasizing that they're not what Christianized. So it brings all your hopes to naught. So you can try all these things; they really need it, but because it won't really take, it's not the greatest, and it may not ever work out. So the white man's burden then is this idea that they have to spread these European cultural concepts to other places, like Africa, for example, would be one of the areas that they will emphasize. Again, if the emphasis is on the superiority of the Europeans because they are industrialized at the expense of the others. You can also see this in the various ads that they have here as well. So this is one way to see how imperialist and racist notions come across in imagery. And so in this case, you have an early advertisement for Pear's soap. And at the top of the image, it says, "The birth of civilization, a message from the sea." And in the background, you can see that there is a ship that is sunk. On the shore, you see what looks to be a stereotypical unindustrialized native. Notice he's wearing very little clothes, and he also has a spear. And you should note as well, too, the dark tone to his skin, because what he has is he has Pear's soap there. And at the bottom, there's a message, and it says, "The consumption of soap is a measure of the wealth, civilization, health, and purity of the people." So what that means is that the Europeans are apparently cleaner. But notice the phrase at the top, the birth of civilization. The idea that something as simple as soap from the Europeans will improve the wealth, civilization, health, and purity of peoples and make them less savage. And these images, of course, are rather shocking by modern standards because of the open and very blatant racism in it, and people really didn't bat an eye at these. This one, of course, is tame compared to one like this. Here, where it talks about how good Pear's soap actually is, with a quote at the top that says, "I have found Pear's soap matchless for the hands and for the complexion." Obviously, here you have the exceedingly racist concept here, where you have a white European individual providing soap and bathing what appears to be an African child, and then as soon as they're bathed, but apparently they didn't dunk their face in, they are clean, they become white, they become European, they become clean. So once again, the idea is that these European concepts of cleanliness and something as simple as soap would continue to, by being provided to Africans or indigenous in various places, would bring them civilization. So that's, again, that concept of cultural superiority on their part. When you look at this image as well, this was the first one that started it off, what you will see is that another Pear's soap advertisement here, and it shows, or it says, "The first step towards lightening the white man's burden is through teaching the virtues of cleanliness." That in itself is cultural superiority. It says, "Pear's soap is a potent factor in brightening the dark corners of the earth as civilization advances, whilst amongst the cultured of all nations it holds the highest place." So what you can see there is not only do you have the emphasis on cleanliness, but you have the exceedingly white captain there who is also wearing white in a very clean environment. And the idea is that that because they are clean and because they are white, they're pure. Notice in the bottom right corner you see what appears to be some sort of potentially a missionary with a box of Pear's soap who is handing it to what looks to be a very unindustrialized native who's wearing nothing more than sort of a loincloth. The idea being that you bring them Pear's soap and it will start them on the way to the virtues of cleanliness. The emphasis is here, the indication is that the natives, whoever they encounter, are unclean compared to the Europeans, that they're dirty. And this also is something that is taken up in the concept or the way in which Europeans see natives that they come across, which is that they are less than them, not just in terms of cleanliness, but culturally, and in fact, racially as well.